War is always the last resort. That's the only thing you should go to when there are no other avenues available. Or at least that's the way it used to be in the United States, or at least that's the way it was on paper. It was. Now, then, it seems we have come to a position to where military force is now a policy option of first choice for some, and diplomacy is almost a dirty word. This is all coming into focus here right now as President Trump was yesterday talking about how he's trying to use diplomacy to avert a war with Iran. And there are others in his inner circle who are massively arguing the opposite. We're going to see this very strange set of circumstances here and how this implicates American national security with no one better than Colonel Douglas Macgregor, defense and foreign policy analyst, former advisor to the Secretary of Defense, and highly decorated combat veteran, and just all-around great guy. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Sure.
Listen, I just want to get right into this because this is very strange to me that you have this public advocacy of some of Trump's biggest supporters up to this point, and they are lobbying for something that's just diametrically opposed to what he had just said. I'm going to show you just a couple of juxtapositions yesterday. First of all, that happened with Larry Kudlow on Fox Business News with Jack Keane, that happened almost the same time as Trump made his comment. First of all, let me show you what Trump said from the Oval Office about what his objectives are.
And on Iran, sir, can you say what your threshold of military action is?
Well, I can't tell you what I'm going to do because right now, we have a tremendous force going there, just like we did in Venezuela, even bigger. And they'll be there soon. And I'd like to see a deal negotiated. I don't know that that's going to happen. But, I mean, if I knew, I wouldn't be able to. I wouldn't tell you. I'd be very foolish if I would tell you. But right now, we're talking to them. We're talking to Iran. And if we can work something out, that'd be great. And if we can't, probably bad things would happen.
So if we can't work something out, probably bad things will happen here. Now, this is in the context, and we'll first of all just look at what President Trump is thinking here. On January 14th, by all accounts, there was going to be a strike against Iran, but then apparently because of some members of the U.S. military and also Netanyahu said, hang on, let's get a little bit more combat power there first. And then this past weekend, all evidence again looked like that was going to be the strike point. But again, it appears that some military experts said, yeah, we still don't have enough combat power. We need a little bit more. And so now we're kind of in a waiting period where it's either President Trump is not sure that he wants to do, or he simply doesn't have enough combat power. Just from that perspective right there, where do you think we are in terms of where President Trump is?
Well, first, based on my limited exposure to him several years ago, I don't believe that Trump really wants to engage in this war against Iran. When he says, he talks about this ridiculous, let's make a deal nonsense, but I think he would like a negotiated arrangement of some kind. But he's also well aware that that's extremely unlikely. First of all, the principal demands from Mr. Netanyahu, which have been repeated by Mr. Trump, are number one, no nuclear enrichment. Number two, you've got to reduce your ballistic missile capability, dismantle some of your missiles. Nothing that can reach Israel is acceptable. And I think the last part is that Iran has to abandon its allies in the region in the event that anything in the future happens involving Israel. And I think that's an impossibility. Now, supposedly the Iranians have said they will talk about the nuclear enrichment matter. That means that we must have said that we could live with something other than no enrichment. But again, that was Mr. Netanyahu's position, no enrichment whatsoever under any circumstances. Now, let's set all of that aside, and we're sending over people that obviously Mr. Netanyahu has complete confidence in, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. What we're planning to do militarily is very clear. This is not remotely related to what you saw in June last year. This strike is designed not to simply destroy Iran. It will destroy Iran if given the opportunity. It's also designed to cause the state itself to disintegrate. Now that was always the idea behind what we were doing in Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia. It's failed there. We now think that we have an opportunity to do to Iran what we had aimed to do against Russia. And this strike, if you will, or campaign, it's really a campaign. It relies not only on naval and naval missile power, but very heavily on the Air Force. In fact, I would argue that the principal punch will be delivered by the Air Force, not the Navy. But everyone is focused on the ships at sea. That's a useful distraction, but I think you're going to see a bombing campaign on the scale of something that we saw in 1991 that went on for 40 days. Now, the difference is that we can't sustain anything for more than 10 days to 2 weeks. That's the fact. That means you've got to achieve your aim of causing the state to disintegrate in that interim period, that 10-day period. There are problems with it, and the problems are also regional. And when you hear people say this will not just be a war between the United States, Iran, and Israel, this will become a regional conflict, is because the states that surround Iran and Israel and are near Iran and Israel, like Turkey, they're very concerned that this could produce waves of refugees. It could pour into their countries, further destabilize their societies, and create a truly regional crisis. The Israelis don't care about that. They would welcome that. They see anything that leads to the destruction of the Muslim states in the region as a good thing. And the more destroyed and fragmented and divided they are, the better. The problem is that could also have an impact on the Europeans. And that means we could see another wave of people that the Europeans do not want, more non-Europeans. And again, the Israelis are happy with that because they have no particular use or like for the Europeans either. So this is something that has nothing to do with the United States of America. This is Israel first in action. And Israel first comes before everything else. Now, something you didn't mention that I just want to bring up that Americans should pay attention to and are really not watching. And that is that on 5 February, the START Treaty, Strategic Arms Reductions Talks Treaty, that we've lived with for 40 years in one form or another, is going out of business. In other words, it's extinguished. The Russians have repeatedly told us they're willing to extend it, and we have simply not answered. Now, if it in fact ceases to exist, that means there are no constraints on the numbers of warheads or platforms. Now, the Russians have tended to stay within the original lines of the agreement. I don't know what we've done. I can't really speak to it, but I know that the Russians have tried to do that. But once this treaty is gone, from the vantage point of Moscow, if you listen to Mr. Peskov's remarks, this is a very serious matter. They view this as, reanimating an existential threat to Russia. Now, going for 40 years with this, which is a long time, this is the first time in 40 years where we will have no arms control arrangement in operation with Russia or previously the Soviet Union. And many of us think this is potentially very dangerous. Some people think it could cause another nuclear arms race, which is eminently possible. It certainly means that the Russians have no obligation to stay within those limitations. It means they could introduce new technologies, new missile categories, new kinds of warheads, a whole range of things. So I hope between now and the 5th of February that someone in the administration will wake up and recognize this is very important. But for the moment, it's Israel first. This is about America first when you start talking about the strategic arms reduction talks. And we're sort of ignoring everything other than what we think has to be done to make the world safe for Israel. And that's really what we're about right now. That's the purpose behind this entire operation. Now, we can talk whether or not you think it'll work. That's another matter.
Yeah, and I do want to get into both of those, but let's just jump right into that one because we just showed you President Trump saying from the Oval Office, the leader of the Republican Party, the president of the armed, the commander in chief, this is where I want to go. And yet across town from Fox Business News, you had two of his otherwise big supporters saying this.
I'm not the expert. You're the expert, General Keane. But I'm just saying, really? Make a deal with Iran? Are we sure about that, sir? Really?
I totally agree with the implications of everything you just said, Larry. I think we have a clear historic choice here. Why is that? If we negotiate with Iran, and let's assume we get a good deal, even the no enrichment, which is the essence of a good nuclear deal, therefore they can't produce a nuclear weapon. Let's say we even got further than that. No ballistic missiles or limited ballistic missiles, and no support for proxies. Those two issues I just mentioned likely are not on the table. Let's assume we even got that far and we have a deal. What does that do? That extends the life of this regime indefinitely. We have a major paradigm shift in the Middle East that has not been achieved since the regime came to power. That was 45 plus years ago. They have been destabilizing this region, killing Americans, killing Israelis, and many others in the region. And we take them off the board finally, and we're able to move forward without this destabilizing barbaric regime. The opportunities for the future are enormous, and who will have achieved that? President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu would have achieved that. And without Trump's involvement here, this doesn't happen. I got to believe the president understands this clearly, and he knows it. He's just not saying all of that because likely he doesn't want to flag exactly what he's going to do. But I got to have some confidence here that he's going to take these guys off the board and move towards a stabilized Middle East.
Yeah, you know, Doug, I have never, I cannot recall in my adult lifetime, and even looking back in history, you know, prior to that, where you had major figures that were publicly lobbying against any kind of diplomacy. And you heard him very specifically say there, even if all those three conditions that you said were laid out were achieved, that would be bad. So the only thing that left, what we should do is to go kill these people, which violates everything. Number one, it violates the Constitution because we can't go to war unless the Congress declares it or unless we've been attacked. And you're saying that, well, just because they exist, we should go kill them. What do you make of that?
Well, he's invoking a number of important assumptions. And the assumption is that there will be no security or safety for Israel as long as the Iranian state in its current form exists, or as long as the Iranian state exists. I'm sure they'd be delighted if it broke up into separate constituent parts. So there's no surprise here. What Americans need to understand, and I think people in the Middle East are beginning to figure out, is this is not the last step in the march to total and complete security, which equates to Israeli Jewish supremacy in the region or Israeli hegemony, however you want to put it. This is not the last step, because once you have successfully destroyed Iran, you will have to turn your attentions to the destruction of Turkey. Now, Turkey, as they call it now, is standing on the sidelines, but they're not stupid. They understand what's really happening. They understand what Israel's goals are, and they've already concluded, I think, that they are inevitably going to come to blows with Israel, and that's probably going to happen in Syria. Turkey is better armed in many respects than Iran. It has a real navy. It has substantially and probably the best army in NATO from the standpoint of numbers and equipment and so forth. So the next step is to destroy Turkey. So let's not delude ourselves what this is about. What General Keane is saying and what Larry Kudlow are saying and what you're hearing from everybody else that's connected to AIPAC and to the Israeli lobby in this country is there can be no peace in the Middle East, no safety for Israel or Jews in the Middle East until the Iranian state is utterly and completely destroyed, defanged, neutralized, pacified, eliminated. In other words, go back to the Morgenthau plan for Germany that was eventually rejected, and understand that that's what you're talking about in Iran. It's reduction to irrelevance, breaking it up, turning it into a pastoral community. The point is that it presents no danger. Now, the other Arab states in the region know this. That's why you're seeing Arab states like Jordan for the first time who are denying access to their airspace. Frankly, it doesn't make any difference. We'll fly wherever we want to, and there's not a damn thing that the Arab states in the region can do about it. But I think the leadership in the Arab states in the peninsula is worried. I mean, all of the leaders in these countries risk being overthrown as a result of what's about to happen, because their populations are seething with anger and hatred for Israel and us. So this is something that has regional and potentially global implications.
And let's look at what that may mean in terms of on the ground. You mentioned a minute ago about the fact that this would be a campaign. In that same interview, Jack Keane also lobbied for a complete campaign. But the question is, does the campaign he outlined, is that something that we can do if Iran doesn't just capitulate and actually sustains, like the Houthis did, for example, and they don't go quickly or quietly? Here's what he said.
To have the offensive punch to really conduct not a strike, but a campaign against Iran, which would likely last not for a couple of days, but actually longer than that. And that means to take down their civilian and military leadership, all these repressive organizations, to include the IRGC, that have been punishing the people, killing somewhere between 10 to 30,000. We don't know the exact number, but even the lower number is completely staggering. 40,000 jailed as a result of it. And also destroy their ballistic missile systems, which they have been managing to recover since June. And I would imagine, given the indication that you just made, Maria, about activity at the nuclear sites, that they would finish off whatever recovery Iran is doing. This is a comprehensive plan to actually take Iran off the board. No president has had this opportunity. This president does.
Well, now, Doug, I can't help but remember what happened with the Houthis, because we had this overwhelming combat power advantage over them, and yet we could not submit or crush them into submission, and we couldn't stop all their missiles. They continue to be able to do that. Iran now has plenty of time and experience from last year to understand how to harden their capacity and to disperse their capabilities. It doesn't seem to me that they would go quite so easily as what Jack Keane's talking about. What do you think?
Well, he's confirmed essentially what we discussed before, setting aside his numbers for the people allegedly killed inside Iran. Those are ridiculous. I don't know about the numbers of people jailed, but there was a concerted effort by MI6, Mossad, and the CIA working together to overthrow the regime. It was a substantial effort. You know, we've talked about that, 40,000 Starlight terminals. The Chinese and the Russians, certainly in their intelligence apparatuses, came to their rescue and helped them eliminate most of those problems. The regime is now very stable, and contrary to popular belief, Iranians are not all on their knees praying that we will bomb their country to rid them of the Ayatollah. That's not the case. Iranian nationalism is a very powerful force. It's imparted a great deal of cohesion to the society. But your question is any of this possible? Can it be done? I think we have 10 days to 2 weeks, and that's it. At that point, I think our strategic arsenal of missiles and conventional munitions that are of an exotic quality, let's put it that way, will have been exhausted. To go any further would be impossible. We wouldn't be able to do it. So I think you're talking about something that can last 10 days to 2 weeks. The question is, can the Iranians outlast that? That's something I don't know. I can't evaluate it. I know that they have dispersed most of their missile arsenal. So you would have to have a lot of munitions for a lot of different targets. And I know they've dispersed their command and control. They have a tightly organized command and control structure that can survive the losses of key figures that will be rapidly replaced. Those people have already been identified. So I'm skeptical that it can work for the reasons that you cite, because after all, the Houthis were very small in a very small area. This is an enormous area the size of Western Europe, and I think 93 million people. So I'm skeptical. I would urge the president to reconsider, and I think he may want to, but I'm not sure he's going to have a choice.
Let me ask you a related question, Doug.
Have brought
That was the looking at the question: can Iran endure for 10 days to continue fighting beyond that and exhaust our initial supply? But if they are as convinced as you are that the whole operation is designed to destroy the Iranian regime, then they have literally no more motivation to withhold anything and to constrain their responses. And in fact, they have an advantage or a reason to start really hitting us and Israel hard after that. So the question to you is, what do you think, given if you were the Iranian leadership, if you started receiving this, and I mean like from the beginning, what would be your reaction to the United States forces in the region?
Well, I would launch, let's put it this way, if I were an Iranian, I would launch the mother of all strikes, and I would target Israel and all of our bases. Those would be my priorities. I would watch carefully to do everything I can to maintain an effective air and missile defense. I would treat the ships at sea as potential targets, but they would not be my priority. As I think I've said before, hitting moving vessels at sea is tougher than many people think. But I think we also don't know exactly what Iran's capabilities are. Could they strike our base on Diego Garcia now? I've talked to some people who think they can. That's something that was impossible the last time around. If that's possible, that could have a huge strategic impact. So the bottom line is, yes, Dan, I think they'll hit all of our bases, but I think Israel will be the principal recipient of everything that they can throw at Israel. And remember, numbers of these ships are there as part of air and missile defense, and the Air Force will also have a role in that. So a lot of what we're doing is going to be connected to the defense of tiny Israel from these massive strikes that are probably going to come in from Iran. I don't know, and I don't think anybody can say with absolute certainty what Iran's true capabilities are. I think the Chinese have invested heavily in them. And what I would also argue is if we're right and this drags on for several days and it begins to erode Iranian strength and staying power, which it could potentially, I don't think the Chinese and the Russians in particular are going to sit quietly and do nothing. Even India is disturbed by all of this because the Indians don't see any benefit to the region and to the world associated with the destruction of Iran. I think Europeans will begin to step back with a degree of horror and fear of what we're doing because of the things that I mentioned before about more refugees. Bottom line is this could become a regional war, and it could spill out of the region, and it could involve the Chinese and the Russians. And I don't think it's a good idea to dismiss that out of hand, to act as though, well, that's impossible. It's not impossible. It's a very real potentiality.
Doug, if any version at all of an Iranian response happens that you just described there, that could be, I mean, let's just look at it from a narrow perspective, from President Trump's personal perspective, problematic in terms of what he wanting to have a domestic agenda, whatever he may think he's going to do in the next 3 years, especially heading into a midterm election where already lots of blue candidates have been succeeding over historically places where Republicans were. That's already because of the things that are going on. If you then add into that many of his supporters voted for him because he said no more stupid wars, and then all of a sudden here's a war by choice, and we start taking a lot of casualties, that seems to be like it would be a real problem for his own agenda.
Dan, I think you're probably right. But on the other hand, you have to look at the people in charge. And for them, what you're projecting seems incomprehensible. I don't think anyone considers the possibility that our military action could fail. I just don't. I think President Trump is first and foremost in that category. And I think Mr. Netanyahu and his agents in the United States are also of that opinion, that we are invincible, that we cannot be defeated. And that's why they're demanding that this happen now. They see this as probably their last best opportunity. I think you could read that into some of what General Keane said. He talks about Iran's weakness. I don't sign up for a weak Iran. I don't think that's the case. But I think what he's really saying is that we may not get another chance like this in the future. Therefore, we have to use everything that we have. I think Mr. Netanyahu feels that way. So the issue of could it fail, I'm not sure that that's even come up for serious discussion. And again, we haven't even talked about what are the impacts on financial markets, on the economy, not just in the United States, but around the world. What does this do to our dollar? We could go on and on and on. But all the news is potentially bad. But I don't think people believe that. I think in Washington, they're planning on success.
Well, there's one person I can tell you absolutely doesn't think that anything negative is possible, and that's President Trump's golfing buddy, Lindsey Graham, who doubled down himself over the weekend and literally called out the president and threw down the Obama card. Watch this.
I think it's a defining moment in his presidency. Ronald Reagan went to the Berlin Wall and he said, tear down this wall. He didn't say, could you make it lower? When asked about what the protesters should do, President Trump said, keep protesting, help is on the way. If this regime is still standing, the day after, if we pull the plug, will be 100 years of chaos. I have every confidence that President Trump will do what he promised to the people. Help is on the way, keep protesting. If this regime falls, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, they all go. It'd be the biggest change since the fall of the Berlin Wall. But here's one thing I know. Donald Trump is Ronald Reagan plus in my mind. Venezuela, soon Cuba. The one thing you can't do as president, talk like Reagan and act like Obama.
Wow, you know that President Trump hates the word Obama or anything associated with it. Do you think that this is going to sway President Trump?
Well, let's be frank. Mr. Netanyahu detested Obama simply because Obama would not go the distance that he demanded. Obama capitulated on some issues, but ultimately Obama's heart was not in this business, and he was a little stronger at that point than I think President Trump is right now, because Obama did not depend as heavily on the donors that are there now as President Trump does. So I don't think, I think Lindsey Graham is essentially telling the world we have to execute something analogous to the Mongolian invasion of Persia and the Middle East, or we're finished. We've lost, and Trump is finished. I don't agree with that, and I don't like the idea of doing to Persia or the Middle East what the Mongols did, because that's effectively what's planned right now from the Air Force and the Navy.
And you know, one other thing, Doug, which I think is important to point out here, all these things that whether it's Kudlow, Keene, or with Tom Cotton, any number of a bunch of other senators, Senator Britt, and certainly Lindsey Graham here, these folks are all lobbying hard. And I have not heard anything about any American national security interest, any American economic interest, or any defense of anything in America. They have not said a word about that. And if all this sounds familiar, it probably should. Here from about a year and a half ago is former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett lobbying for the same thing.
What we need to ensure is that this octopus of terror, whose head is in Tehran and its arms are all around the region and the world, by the way, they want to assassinate Americans in America, Iran. So by ultimately strangling that head of the octopus, cutting the head off, the whole octopus of terror goes away, and America is safe, Israel is safe, the world is safe.
So, I mean, this has been going on and been blasting to Americans for a long time. But Doug, I mean, we got to just call it what it is. This is 100%, not 95, 100% in the interest of one nation, and it's Israel, and it's not ours. Why then do we have literally that? Gary, put that graphic up again of all the combat power we have in that region. Why is all of the American combat power, air and sea, basically handed over to the prime minister of another country?
Well, you know, the why has a lot to do with money and power that flows from enormous wealth. And enormous wealth was invested to put President Trump into the White House. And President Trump is not going to turn a deaf ear to the people that put him there. We just have to understand that. I think it's deplorable. I don't support it. And by the way, I would go one step further. I'm not anxious to see Israel destroyed. I never have been. I've been worried since the sort of revenge campaign after 7 October that Israel would put itself in an impossible position in the region where it couldn't possibly exist in the future because of all the bad blood that's being shed all over the countryside. I'm really worried about that. Obviously, the Israeli government isn't. They think that if they can destroy everything around them and anyone that is not willing to subordinate themselves to Israeli national interest, that's a good thing. But that's not necessarily attainable. We could go on, but I'm really concerned right now because I look at the White House and I get the impression that it's like a nuclear power station that's already in meltdown. It's got enormous problems in the financial markets. The economy is not sound, contrary to popular belief. We are in a very fragile position, and the American public wants action, but not necessarily what we're doing in the Middle East. It could rebound to our disadvantage in a dramatic way. And when I say it's like a nuclear power station, I think everybody is running around trying to manage all the things that are wrong. You heard President Trump earlier in that particular discussion say, well, we have a lot of things going. And he mentions Ukraine and what's happening there and what's happening in the Middle East and talked about Venezuela briefly. But he didn't talk about what's happening inside the United States. What's happening in the United States is very important, much more important than anything we're doing overseas. And what I see happening in a place like Minnesota, which admittedly could have been handled better, is a retreat from the enforcement of federal law, which is vital and essential if we are going to survive as a nation, let alone as a great power. So that's why I'm saying that, a lot of people are focused on different things, and we're setting everything aside, just as we started by talking about the START Treaty, setting that aside, which I consider to be very dangerous and ill-advised, all in favor of making Israel first a reality. So you're correct. We are going to war for reasons that have nothing to do with what is important to us and everything to do with the interests of Israel and and the diaspora and its agents in the United States.
Yeah, and Doug, and I'm right with you on, and I have been since 10/7 all the way through that the Israeli policies of Netanyahu have been undermining the security and the long-term stability of Israel itself. And I have been so adamant against it, not negative or against Israel, but for Israel, because they're going down a path that I think is going to eventually be self-destructive, and we could be on that path right now. Pretty much, and you've laid this out really well here. We have to just hope against hope that this meltdown won't happen. And we'll just roll the dice and hope that putting a little bit of water on the cooler is going to work, because if Iran isn't as weak as what Keane and all these other folks say, and if they have the abilities to sustain through that 10 or 12 day period and continue to be viable and continue to throw missiles, and then all of a sudden we don't have enough to go with it, everything could start to crumble. And it's so ironic because you have probably one of the biggest ones in America, the pro-Israeli guy is Mark Levin on Fox News. And it's so perverse that in advocating that Trump do what he wants, he could literally be making things worse for his own country. Watch this.
Those people are suffering from a complete lack of civil liberties, a destitute economy, and a nearly non-existent middle class. It used to have a very vibrant middle class. Not anymore. The regime controls all aspects of the culture, communication, even whether the lights are turned off or on throughout the country, just like North Korea. And it is turning into a countrywide concentration camp, just like North Korea. Now, if we don't act, and by that I mean not diplomacy, but decisively, quickly and overwhelmingly, with our military against the top of the regime, Khomeini and his cohorts in that circle, Iran will in fact build nuclear weapons, as North Korea has, despite dozens of agreements over the decades with Republican and Democrat presidents.
So again, he is literally pleading against any diplomacy, and we have to use our military to go after them. And he's just got to hope that they don't have the ability to shoot back in ways that's going to harm Israel itself.
Well, I'm sure everyone in Iran is deeply moved by his expression of concern for the Iranian people.
Oh, I'm sure they are.
Look, his agenda is obvious. It's not American. It's Israeli. That's fine. But I can't sign up for that particular agenda because, as I said earlier, I think it will backfire badly on us. It'll have a terrible impact on the region. And I think it'll ultimately backfire on Israel. But it doesn't matter what we think. We're not in power. We're not in authority. We don't have $1 billion at our disposal. We can't buy politicians right now. We can't buy any access to the presidency. And if you don't have billions of dollars, you can't do that in the American system that the billionaires have created. You're irrelevant. And they're very happy about that. I mean, President Trump actually made a joke recently where somebody was comparing his hair to Justin Bieber. And he responded, well, the difference between a wet raccoon and my hair is that I have $3 billion in the bank. Well, I think he's telling you what he values, telling you what's important. And you and I and what we think are not important. And I think millions of Americans are watching that and listening to that. And they're asking, my God, what did I do when I voted for this man?
Yeah, and right now it's a kind of a rhetorical question like that. But in the event that we start suffering lots of casualties in a war we chose, and it's not going well, and Iran is not playing its script and losing like it's supposed to be, those questions will get a little bit harder to contemplate. But right now, that's all theoretical. As you say, no one knows for sure what Iran can do or what it will do, and we all have to wait and find out. But I suspect that diplomacy is not going to succeed, and we're going to find out one way or the other here pretty soon. What do you think?
Well, I think so. One last point before we go. I think we need to understand something. This is not the end of the process. If Iran is successfully destroyed and disintegrates, the next step on this ladder will be Turkey. And I think anybody who believes otherwise in the region is foolish. I think the Turks are aware of that. So this is not the end. This is just the near-term goal. Now, the question is, what do the American people do? Let's face it, the Americans have slept through most of these conflicts and crises over 30, 40 years. That's one of our problems, that what happens beyond our borders has not mattered a great deal to us because we're very focused on what happens here. And that's, in my judgment, that's appropriate. I agree with that. But this will be different, and this will change everything for us globally, not just regionally in the Middle East.
Well, we're certainly going to watch and how that goes on. Before I let you go, though, I want to get your views on something else that's happening. You mentioned a little bit about the START Treaty, about what's going on in Europe. There's some bigger issues, well, maybe not bigger, additional issues that also impact American national security, and that is on the transatlantic relationship and where a lot of that is going. You have been a long-time advocate that NATO should have gone the way of the dodo bird a long time ago because it outlived its usefulness, et cetera. That seems to maybe be belatedly occurring to some in Europe now, especially with President Trump's move potentially on Greenland and all the angst that caused. And at the Oslo Security Conference yesterday, or maybe it was even this morning, the Radmila Shekerinska, sorry if I'm butchering her name, I feel so bad for that, the Deputy NATO Secretary General is acknowledging that there has been a big shift and is acknowledging that maybe Europe needs to pay more attention to its own security.
It is true that the time when we could, some would say conveniently, give up on focusing on security and allow the US to deal with it is over. And this is a much more just and more stable arrangement in which not only US but also Canada and European allies can trust. And I have to say that trust goes both ways. Yeah. But it is true that for many years, actually decades, as Europeans, we got used to US carrying most of the burden in an unacceptable way, maybe acceptable after the Second World War. But practically, this has been the source of frustration for so many years and for so many administrations. We also have to be open about this fact. And there is a clear sense, and I would say even understanding and consensus among all allies that we will continue to develop, you called it previously, European pillar of NATO, European defense within NATO, and this balance sharing, actually balance shifting, will strengthen the alliance.
So, do you think that Europe is finally belatedly recognizing balance, burden shifting, that they're going to have to pick up more? Do you think that's going to happen?
Well, there's nothing original in her remarks. In a speech in Munich in 2017, Chancellor Merkel made the statement that it was clear, based upon her observations and interactions with the Trump administration, that Europe could no longer depend upon the United States, that Europe would have to find its own way, that it was simply a fact of life. And then subsequently we had President Macron of France, who made the famous statement that NATO was brain dead, that NATO needed to rethink everything it was doing. Look, NATO has been a zombie organization for some time. The crisis, war in Ukraine has destroyed NATO. That's something that I believed was going to happen in January of 2022, and I said it. The Russians haven't had to drop a single bomb or fire a single round in the direction of NATO. NATO has destroyed itself. It's destroyed itself because it aligned itself with the wrong people for the wrong reasons in Ukraine. It involved itself in something for which it was never designed. It tried to wage an offensive war using primarily American and selected equipment from other European states with the NATO command structure. It's failed miserably. They weren't prepared for a very new and different kind of war, and the Russians discovered how they could effectively counter anything that the NATO alliance could come up with. And right now, just a little east of and south of Zaporizhia, you have a giant battle of encirclement commencing that will probably finish off what remains of the Ukrainian combat power that's still on the ground that could do anything. So I don't think she's telling anybody anything that we haven't already figured out. The question now is, what does the future look like? And I don't think NATO in its current form has a future. You're going to see new kinds of security arrangements that are more regionalized, that conform to the interests of the people that live there. Because the people that live in Oslo or Berlin or Warsaw do not see the same threat picture as the people that live in Rome or Madrid or in Athens. It's a simple fact. And Turkey, of course, is a NATO member largely in name only and has been for some time. It has very different interests. It sees itself rightly as a great power in the region with its own interests. So I'm not sure this woman's statement is very meaningful, Dan. It should get a big yawn from everybody. Thanks very much. We figured that out already. And the question is, what's the future look like? It does not look like the current NATO alliance.
You know, and that was also not the idea that they're going to put some feet behind that and to do something about it for their own national security was belied a little bit with Secretary General Mark Rutte, who earlier today was in Kiev, and in that situation there, he was talking about. You know what? He was acting like that there had not been the last 4 years of war. I won't show you the soundbite right now, but basically he is saying, yeah, we're still with you. The NATO is still going to be there, and you can count on us, and we're going to be there for you. And you know, and I'm like, you got to be kidding me. The juxtaposition between this couldn't be more clear. That there's almost no power in the capital city other than the generators for this shot here, and you're talking like everything's going to be good. And if that's the NATO, the mentality, then where is how is that going to scare Russia, for example? If NATO is so detached from reality, Doug, how is Russia going to be afraid that NATO is one day going to be an existential threat?
Well, the short answer is no one's afraid. How afraid were the Soviets or Nazis in 1939 of the British Empire and the French? Remember, the Poles flew from Warsaw to London in search of a guarantee for their security. And the British, unfortunately, under the influence of people like Churchill, said, oh, yes, of course, we'll give you a guarantee. And we'll stand with you. You know, we'll be with the Poles. And what happened? Well, the Germans and the Soviets intervened, carved up Poland, and not a single solitary British Royal Air Force fighter took off to fight anybody. The British Navy did nothing. They declared war, but ultimately it didn't make any difference to the Poles. And I think that's exactly what's been happening ultimately in Eastern Europe with Ukraine. And if the Eastern Europeans are smart, they will throw this nonsense under the bus and start looking at arrangements that provide them with security, because asking us to show up in a moment's notice to travel 7,000 miles in a heartbeat to save them from anybody is absurd. And I think President Trump has tried to tell them that as politely as he could, certainly during his first term, and probably a little less politely during his second. NATO is a dead end. And I don't care what Rutte says. Rutte is sitting there with the fools in London in 1939 and doesn't seem to understand that great powers are not going to pay any attention to that. Right now, the great power in Eurasia and Europe is Russia.
Well, and it's funny you mentioned that. It's also interesting that a second ago you said you thought is curious that Europe and NATO seems to prioritize the interest of Ukraine over its own national interests. Well, you're not the only one that was thinking that. Earlier today, Sergei Lavrov was asked about some reports that Europeans were complaining that Russia is trying to put a wedge between Europe and the United States over Ukraine. And he had this response.
Но это не наш вопрос. Как говорится, если получаешь удовольствие, то это твоя проблема. Нас трудно обвинить в том, что мы вбивали клинья. Это Европа пыталась и пытается до сих пор вбивать клинья между Россией и Соединенными Штатами, усматривая в политике Соединенных Штатов при президенте Трампе некий, как они считают, крен в пользу России в ущерб интересам Европы. Но как раз вот слово «интересы» здесь очень актуально, потому что когда страна, как это делает Россия, наши друзья в Китае, в Эмиратах, в Индии, в других государствах отстаивают свои интересы, ну, к ним и относятся соответственно. Когда, вот как в случае с большинством европейских элит, они свои интересы поменяли на интересы украинского режима и всячески используют этот режим, чтобы воевать против России, уже не скрывая, и готовятся к войне напрямую со своим участием. Но, наверное, тогда к ним отношение будет такое.
I mean, do you think he's got a point there, that it seems like more like the Europeans are trying to put a wedge between the United States and Russia rather than the other way around? How do you see that?
Well, first, let's make it clear that the Russians haven't had to drive a wedge between us and Europe. Europe has done that very effectively. And there's a realization in Washington that our interests and the interests of the Europeans do not coincide. The problem with Minister Lavrov's comments is the following. Yes, President Trump has expressed his goodwill and good intentions on numerous occasions vis-a-vis Russia. The problem is he hasn't done anything. And what President Trump needed to do right after he took office was pull the plug on the Ukraine issue completely. The most corrupt state in the world, engaged in all sorts of horrible criminality, stealing hundreds of billions of dollars from us, from the Europeans, anybody else they can get their hands on, led by a criminal gang sitting in Kiev. They don't represent the Ukrainian people's interests. They have sacrificed the Ukrainian people and the nation of Ukraine on the altar of greed, corruption, and self-interest. That's what Kiev is all about. They need to go away. President Trump should have pulled the plug. Had he pulled the plug and said, we're out, that would have helped enormously. The other thing he should do, he said, we've got 100,000 American troops stretching from Lithuania all the way to Romania. To do what? The Russians aren't coming, and we don't want a war with Russia. So why are they there? To reassure the Europeans? Obviously, that hasn't worked. The Europeans aren't happy. Fine. Let's get out. Let the Europeans man up, as they say, and meet their own obligations, determine what their interests are. It's time they did it. The Russians aren't going to interfere with that. They would welcome a European group of states that were led by people who were interested in their own populations. Remember, these are the same people in Western Europe that invited millions of people from North Africa, the Middle East, and God knows where else into their countries, which they would all like to expel. All they've done is destabilize their own societies. this is the sad part. President Trump's instincts are excellent. He doesn't act on them.
And last question I have before I let you go. One of the arguments against doing what you suggest, and what I have certainly advocated as well, that we should have withdrawn from the beginning of Trump's administration and turn this over to the Europeans, or say y'all either negotiate it or you're on your own, is that they say, well, then if you withdrew, if you took all those American troops out, that would be a vacuum that Russia would fill in, and then they would come and attack. They would see that as weakness, and they would attack the West. What do you say to that?
Well, I just said there's no evidence for that at all. It's the exact opposite. Anybody sitting in the Kremlin looks at the disaster area in Central West Europe, and they don't want anything to do with it. I mean, why would they want to come in and deal with the enormous problems Europe has created for itself? Let's look at Germany as being on the path of national suicide for a long time. First, it was the massive opening of their borders, which was a catastrophe. Merkel did more damage while she was there than Adolf Hitler did, in my judgment. And now you have this man, Merz, who's extended the damage, maybe even more so. Germany is being deindustrialized. Its population is frustrated, despondent. The only thing that keeps the population from ruining Berlin and throwing out the government are the pensions. Germans are very conservative people. As long as they open the mail and they have their pension check and it goes into their bank account, they're not going to do much. Well, when that stops, when they can't afford to eat anymore, then they will act. And I think President Putin knows that. But you don't want to go in there and take responsibility for the mess. You don't want to manage it. The Russians have their own problems and their own interests. The good thing about the Russians is that they know things are not perfect, and they've got a plan to deal with that, to make it work. We don't even recognize all the problems that we have, and we have no plan to deal with any of it. That's the problem. That's why we elected President Trump, because he promised to focus on what was happening here. It hasn't really happened. And we see now that there was no real effective strategy, let alone a public affairs strategy, let alone trained spokesmen who could stand up without embarrassing themselves. And we sent people in, and it hasn't worked very well. And so Americans absolutely support the mass deportation of millions of people that don't belong here, but they don't like to be disturbed by ugly pictures on the television. It's sort of like, I think it was Dean Acheson, I could be wrong, who said back in the 1960s, if American soldiers are to be killed anywhere, it should happen at night. It should never be filmed, and no one should ever see the corpses. Because if they do, that is a disaster for the American people. In other words, don't show the American people what we know will irritate and anger them. And we know what happened during Vietnam. As the casualties mounted, support for the war plummeted. The rest is history. So I think in that sense, your comment about Iran is probably accurate. But right now, what we're dealing with in Europe is of European construction. They were helped in this by Biden and Obama and others. But President Trump right now has tried to follow his instinct and say, you've got to be your own first responders. That's all he said. He didn't say, we're walking out of NATO, we're leaving NATO. He just said, we can't get there in time to make a difference. You've got to do your part. Well, all of that's failed. So let's get real. Let's get out. Now,
yeah. That's certainly what we hope happens, and even more so than that, I still hope against hope that we don't have to have you back on next in the coming days here talking about the war in Iran and how that's going. Let's hope that doesn't have to happen, and that there's at least a shot to focus on the things here that do matter for our future. And we'll wait and see how it's going. But in any case, very grateful for you coming on today, and you never pull any punches, and we really appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Dan.
And we appreciate you guys too. Just a quick note here. We're going to have Alexander Mercurius who's going to look at some of these issues from the European side. He's got some great insights. You're not going to want to miss that. 1:30 p.m. Eastern time today. Alexander Mercurius on our show. We will see you then on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.